This was the scene at a recent gathering of thousands on St. Peter's Square, or as the Vatican calls it, Wednesday. Visitors still throw coins in the Trevi Fountain and marvel at the Colosseum, but right now, the #1 tourist attraction in the Eternal City is the 78-year-old Argentine with a common touch that appears most uncommon. He's put new bounce in a church that for the last decade has largely been defined by its troubles. The 266th Vicar of Christ has in stunning short order managed to change the conversation. Today the Vatican seems less like a fire department and more like, well, a church. American Catholics would like to change more than the conversation, and polls show they believe the agent of that change is Pope Francis. But is a church supposed to change? Does it evolve with the times, or is it connected to ideals and a faith that are timeless? It is the world's smallest country, but it is home to the world's largest church. And these 110 acres produce one of the world's most potent exports. It is the opposite of Las Vegas. What happens here fans out all over the globe. Good evening and welcome to the Vatican, the home of the Roman Catholic Church in Rome. I'm Devin Scillian. I'm glad you're with us. The last time I stood on this square was March 13th of last year. The College of Cardinals emerged from the Sistine Chapel and actually shocked us twice. First, by naming a new pope on just the 5th ballot, and then again when we found out who that new pope was. Maybe we should have known then that surprise would become the theme of the new papacy. Because after years of scandal and declines on both sides of the Catholic altar, it seems we're at a crossroads, thanks to the Francis factor. Popes generally don't resign. Only 4 in the last 1,000 years, and none in the last 600, until Pope Benedict XVI announced he would be stepping down. Speculation runs hot even today. Had the burden of scandal become too great? The VatiLeaks episode was poised to vomit salacious stories of Vatican intrigue all over the place. Or was it simply that Benedict's health was beginning to fail, and he doubted that the Church could weather a prolonged decline like that of his predecessor, John Paul II?
In February of 2013, I looked at Pope Benedict's schedule, and I saw he had very little on his calendar for 2013.
John Thavis is the best-selling author of the Vatican Diaries.
I became a little concerned, and I flew back to Rome February 10th. I walked into the Vatican press office February 11th in time to hear the Pope resigning. And it was shocking even to me, although I knew that as Pope he had always considered the possibility.
It was a shocker. The world's cardinals were called home, and preparations were made for the ancient papal selection process in the Sistine Chapel, known as the conclave. There is no such thing as a routine conclave. There's nothing inconsequential about one, and yet this one had a particular heaviness. 8 years from the death of John Paul II and wrestling with turmoil, Vatican watchers felt the Church needed a titan. The cardinals felt it too.
Here's what's clear to me, Devin, as one who was honored to take part in the conclave without breaking confidentiality. You know, those days before the conclave, when we meet daily for about 10 days in what we call the congregations, we listen to one another. We get to know one another. It's very clear to me that he listened intently.
Cardinal Bergoglio stood up in the meetings before the conclave, and he made it very clear that we need to change some things. And he said we need to be more active in people's lives as a church.
Those of us on the square had no idea how quickly Cardinal Bergoglio was wrapping up the process. There's a long-held admonition against trying to handicap a conclave. The saying goes, if you go into the conclave a pope, you come out of it a cardinal. Legend has it that Cardinal Bergoglio had actually come in second in the prior conclave, and yet he seemed well down the list of favorites known as the papabili. Claudio Lavanga is an Italian reporter who covers the Vatican for foreign networks. He remembers the burst of chaos when the conclave came to a shockingly sudden end.
We made these cards, 12 cards of the papabili, the cardinals that were tipped to become popes, and Bergoglio was 12. So when I said Bergoglio, my producer was throwing all the cards, and suddenly Bergoglio was the last one, because we didn't really know who he was.
The election of Cardinal Bergoglio, I think, shocked pretty much everybody, mainly because, number one, he was 76 years old. People figured, well, We have a pope who just resigned. We're not going to elect an elderly man, but they did.
Habemus Papam.
It took no time at all for the new pope to go from an obscurity to a pioneer. In just those initial moments on the balcony, the first piled up quickly, the first pope from the Western Hemisphere, the first Jesuit to become pope, and, most tellingly perhaps, the first to adopt the name of Francis of Assisi, who devoted his life to caring for the poor.
And then he comes out in the balcony, and clearly he was a bit shocked there because of the warm welcoming of the enormous crowd. And he just stood there saying nothing for minutes and minutes. And you thought, okay, well, here's another Benedict. He doesn't really know what to do and how to work a crowd.
Buonasera.
How wrong were we?
There was a collective grasp for meaning. Historic? Yes. But beyond that, well, what? Victor Torres, a Catholic from Mexico, seemed way ahead of the rest of us.
I believe that he is going to do really something that we need right now. I mean, he's going to provide us hope in the future, hope in the world needs this guy.
But when he got on the bus with the Cardinals the night he was elected, that was the first sign. The second sign, when he bowed to the people from the balcony and asked people to pray for him and had that moment of silence, that was extraordinary. Then the next day he goes and pays his hotel bill. When was the last time you saw a pope pay for anything?
It is hard to come up with anyone so quickly embraced and so quickly impactful on public life, especially given the 2,000 tons of expectation that are immediately hoisted onto the shoulders of the leader of the world's 1 billion Catholics.
There's no question. There's no question about it. I feel that it's like, again, it's God's gift that he brings people together.
Pope Francis, he's bringing in a new generation of people, a new kind of group of Catholics of all different ages, people who maybe were fallen away Catholics.
March 19th, I'm sitting next to the Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna, Christoph Schornborn, for the Pope's first Mass, March 19th. Cardinal Schornborn is one of the brightest men on the planet, certainly one of the great intellectuals of the College of Cardinals. And after Pope Francis gave his first homily, that went 11 minutes, by the way, not bad. I knew we had a winner. When we stood up to do the creed, Cardinal Schornborn turns to me, and there's tears in his eyes, and he says to me, "Tim, this man speaks like Jesus." And I said to him, "Chris, I think that's the job description." And he's doing it, okay? And the world is saying, wow, we need this.
There have been 265 popes since St. Peter. When we come back, the 5 short words it was hard to imagine any of them uttering until Pope Francis did.
Crossroads, the Francis Factor, is brought to you by the Capuchin Friars, building community in Detroit, and Alliance Catholic Credit Union, empowered by faith, inspired by you.
Welcome back. The late Christopher Hitchens was no fan of religion. He once said, "My favorite time in the cycles of public life is when a pope is dead and they haven't elected a new one because there's no one in the world who's infallible for the next few weeks." Cynically or otherwise, that notion of infallibility, of transcendence, has long been attached to the papacy. And that's why it was such a jolt to the system when Pope Francis uttered a short phrase that has been parsed, debated, retweeted, and weaponized ever since. Who am I to judge?
Ma chi sono io per giudicarla?
It happened on the flight back from World Youth Day in Rio. The Pope wandered back to the journalists who were flying with him.
It was extraordinary because he was asked a question about is there a gay lobby in the Vatican? There was an Italian magazine that was their cover that week. And then he went on to talk about lobbies. He's not a big fan of them. And then the most interesting thing is he went back to that issue.
If a person is gay and accepts the Lord and has goodwill, who am I to judge them?
He went back to that idea and said, if a priest comes to me and he is gay, but he is a man of goodwill and he loves God, who am I to judge?
The phrase suddenly became the great Catholic ink blot. What did it mean? What did you see in it? What was it telling us about Francis and where he's headed?
Who am I to judge? Those 5 words, right, I don't think have ever been spoken by a pope, and they were shocking to people.
Cardinal Dolan isn't sure they should have been.
Who am I to judge? You know, and how beautiful, because you were right, Devin, in that we sort of there was a sense of alarm and shock, but all he's doing is repeating what Jesus said.
In fact, Catholic broadcaster Teresa Tomeo didn't see it as shocking at all.
And in the Catholic media, we were all saying, okay, this is nothing new. Why is this such a big deal? We couldn't understand what the big news was, and as a matter of fact, I dealt with this on my show over and over again with people calling in saying, why are they saying this is something new? The church teaches that God is the ultimate judge in terms of a person's salvation.
I don't buy that. I don't think that, I think Pope Francis said what he wanted to say. I don't think he wanted to be very specific because, once again, his aim here is not to suddenly throw the debate open again and have the church talking about nothing but gay marriage or homosexuality. His aim is to set it aside so that the church can get on with its work of spreading the gospel.
Well, and that's quoted very often, but it's taken in sense out of context, and it's not the whole quote.
That's Cardinal Edmund Sciacca on the same quotation. You get a sense of the parlor game that quickly developed.
If someone who's a homosexual is praying, trying to do the right thing, who am I to judge him? But that's a different context. He's saying here's a homosexual who's trying
seeking God
to lead a chaste life. Yeah.
Homosexuals are left with tough choices on Sunday mornings. While some churches have reached out to the gay community, many, including the Catholic Church, see it as a matter of loving the sinner, hating the sin.
Homosexuality, not the attraction of homosexuality, but the activity, and this is right in the Catechism and you can look it up, the activity is the sin, not the inclination or not the attraction. So I think we have to be clear on that, okay? And that's nothing new. That too is church teaching.
Pope Benedict and I think Pope John Paul II have underlined the aspect that the church cannot accept. They have called homosexuality intrinsically disordered, and really that's the kind of language that alienates people.
Indeed, gay Catholics may feel like they're trapped in an elegant box. The church wants sex to be confined to marriage. The church won't accept gay marriage. Ergo, gay Catholics must simply resolve to live a life of chastity. It should be pointed out here that to live within the directives of the church, any unmarried Catholic is expected to live a life of chastity. Peggy Stanton of Ave Maria Radio sees homosexuality as something that has to be managed. She, too, makes a distinction between inclination and actual behavior.
If you have same-sex attraction, that's a difficulty, right? I have a temper, but I'm not going to go out on the street and form a temper society and say, everybody come here and scream with me. You know, I'm going to try to overcome the temper.
What was remarkable about Pope Francis was not only that he said, who am I to judge, but that he didn't raise that issue of homosexuality is in some way disordered, and that was new.
And in fact, here I was listening to several different points of view, a solid debate between writers and journalists, and wondering if this was what Pope Francis hoped to avoid.
That's the strategy of Francis. Let's start with the truth, the beauty, the goodness. Don't start with the do's and don'ts, okay? Because like he says, they know that already. Let's start with the truth, the beauty, the goodness, the grace, the mercy, the invitation.
I think Pope Francis is setting it well that let's not worry about that, but let's just allow people into the church, hear their story, journey with them, get to know them.
Yes, all of that out of Who Am I to Judge, which, by the way, was just part of the Pope's prolifically quotable year. In digital terms, Pope Francis can be seen as the world's most influential dignitary. No world leader is retweeted more than Pope Francis. And yet, after a year of more jaw-droppers than Game of Thrones, a fair question still hangs in the Catholic air. What will actually change? We'll dig into that when we continue from the Vatican. Just about any exclusive club can have more members if it's willing to change the terms of membership. It's a rather profound conundrum for the Catholic Church. A lot of American Catholics, hoping for dramatic changes in church doctrine, are investing hope, even trust, that Pope Francis has a revolution or two up his sleeve. But for all of the provocative statements of the last year, will anything truly change? On an aircraft carrier the size of the Catholic Church, change comes by degrees, even fractions of degrees. It's generally more evolution than revolution, and yet American Catholics seem eager for change.
I would like to see more change happen. I would like to see change happen faster in the Catholic Church, but I know that sometimes that's not being realistic.
What changes? Well, it's important to point out you seldom hear modern Catholics debating what might be considered the linchpins of the faith. There aren't many debates in the pews over the nature of grace, over the promise of salvation. No, the tears come on the outer edges of the fabric. A study from the never more appropriately named Pew Research this past winter found American Catholics overwhelmingly in favor of allowing Catholics to use birth control, 77% saying they support it. The support was almost as strong for allowing priests to get married. Almost 3/4 believe priests should have that right. 68% believe it's time that women were allowed to become priests. And while not anything close to a mandate, half of those surveyed believe the Church should allow same-sex partners to be married. Terribly interesting data, but the Catholic Church isn't a democracy. Surely there must be some things in the Catholic Church that make it Catholic.
To become a Catholic, you have to accept the Church's doctrine. We don't make exceptions. Somebody says, I'll become a Catholic, but I won't believe this. No, you can't. I won't believe this or that. He has to take the whole package.
True enough. When you visit the Vatican, you won't find a suggestion box. And yet, Pew wasn't the only group doing research. This past winter, Pope Francis reached out, wondering what was going on in the hearts and minds of the flock.
Now, this was groundbreaking. This survey that Pope Francis ordered on dioceses around the world to say, let's see what the Catholics really think of the teaching of the Church. And the results are in, and it shows that most Catholics, especially young Catholics, think that they are out of touch with modernity.
But was that survey simply data collection? Was the Church just taking the cultural temperature of the faithful? Or was it a suggestion box?
So I think he's going to listen to that, otherwise he wouldn't have ordered that survey.
I think American Catholics, perhaps more than others, are going to be looking for substantial changes. And substantial depends on where you sit on the spectrum.
Well, let's look at it from the spectrum posed by the Pew study. 3/4 say they're ready for the Church to endorse birth control. Jessica Nabongo is a Detroit native who's been working in Rome, but her family originally hails from Uganda. For her and others, third world concerns put birth control in a different light.
In terms of family planning, this is a real issue for maternal mortality and all of these sorts of issues. So by restricting that in the doctrine, it causes a lot of stress and trauma for women in developing countries. So I really think if there is something to change, definitely the idea of birth control is one of them.
Many Catholics I talked to seem to feel this one was an easy enough change for the Church. But the odds of it happening under Francis?
The difficulty with chemical birth control or devices for birth control are that they impede the gift of self between husband and wife, and there is it is a call to a more generous way of living.
He's not going to reverse the Church's teaching on birth control either.
Jessica also believes it's time to ordain women, and as the survey showed, she's not alone.
First of all, you have to deal with the founder. Jesus Christ sets the rules, right? So he designated his apostles to hold these roles. He designated that they would be the ones that are bishops and they would be the ones who are priests.
You know, I think there are some who won't be happy until Pope Francis ordains women priests, and I don't think that's going to happen. He's not going to say the Church will bless gay marriage. I think those things are not going to change at all.
I don't get the sense that suddenly we are going to see a dramatic change in doctrine under Pope Francis. What we are going to see is a change in the way the Church responds to the needs of the people.
And yet American Catholics seem to be developing an expectation of change from Pope Francis. Archbishop Vigneron wonders at what that could mean.
I hope we don't have a point, get to have the result that people have expected something and then they're going to have their expectations dashed. That would be very unfortunate. I mean, these principles, we didn't invent them, they come to us from Christ.
That's too much of a change to expect in such a short time. There are all the things that need to change first, the easier things.
Such as?
The Synod of Bishops, which he has convened on the theme of the family, is going to discuss the situation of divorced Catholics.
Right now, a Catholic who is divorced and then remarried isn't supposed to be taking communion, the church position being that they're guilty of adultery. Pope Francis has already encouraged debate among the cardinals on this issue.
I do believe we're going to see a change on this.
Archbishop Vigneron doesn't expect change there, and neither does Cardinal Sciacca.
There's been talk about that, but again, I think they take some of his things out of context. He talks about having more compassion, understanding, and so on, but he doesn't say he's going to change that they can now receive communion. I don't think he will.
Interestingly, John Thavis actually gives a fighting chance to at least considering a change on allowing priests to marry.
I think the priestly celibacy rule is going to come up under Pope Francis, going to come up for discussion. I don't know that the Pope will push for a change, but I know that he's open to a change.
When I asked New York Cardinal Dolan if what we've seen thus far from Pope Francis is more style than substance, he asked me to see that at the level of the papacy, style is substance.
His job description is to preserve the integrity of what we call the deposit of faith and pass that on. John the 23rd had a beautiful, he said, we got the deposit of faith, but how we pass it on, and the deposit of faith can't be altered, how we pass it on, how effectively, how colorfully we pass it on, that can change, and that we need to change. So we shouldn't downplay style, because it's very, very important. How you do something is sometimes more important than what you do.
And many in the church see the idea of changing to keep up with the times as pure folly. It is a profound question. Is a church elastic? Should it be like water and adapt to the vessel into which it's poured? Or is it the vessel, structured, reliable, and certain in its ancient footing?
There are certain things that come with the program. And why should I say, well, I want to be Catholic and do anything I want? Then you're not Catholic.
In fact, that's the risk of stretching out the tent stakes. Any dilution of the core foundations of the church can be an insult to those drawn to its cloisters for those very reasons.
But what's the point? Why call yourself Catholic if you're not going to believe anything the church teaches? I mean, seriously.
And yet it seems impossible to deny that Pope Francis wants the church to meet people where they are, at least initially.
Cultures change, times change, and we relate to those situations. But there are certain dogmatic issues that we have in the church and beliefs which are unchangeable.
In fact, and it is admittedly anecdotal thus far, but the change in style seems to already be paying dividends.
But people are going back, and I hear that, especially in the States. I hear that all the time. We're actually going back to the church.
There's a long list of terms connected to modern Catholics that speak to the church's struggles. Lapsed Catholic, recovering Catholic, perhaps toughest for the church, former Catholic. What keeps American Catholics connected to a church that is often at odds with their current outlook? More on that when Crossroads, the Francis Factor, continues. Welcome back. I am not Catholic. It's probably because I didn't grow up Catholic. If you're Catholic, chances are that's how you were raised. They expect to build their continuity that way, keeping the flock in the field, if you will. But of late, critics of Catholic doctrine say the church is not only missing the opportunity to reach out to new souls, it's been slamming the door on too many of its own.
I've never been in another church of another denomination where I felt there was judgment being made the way sometimes I have within the Catholic Church.
It wasn't easy for the church to chase Lynn Pellerito away. She was raised in a deeply devout Catholic family, but she married a divorced man and was unable to have a Catholic wedding because their request for an annulment of the first marriage was denied. Then they divorced. Mass by mass, issue by issue, she drifted away and now attends a non-denominational church. She still feels very Catholic, but she feels locked out.
I may not understand all the rules, but I don't believe for a moment that Jesus would turn someone away from going to communion. It's almost offensive to me to not invite people up to communion.
There is a crisis, and it's out there, and it's in the numbers. You know, people have been fleeing churches.
And yet, some churches are finding ways to grow, explosively even. And many of them are doing it by filling their sanctuaries with wandering Catholics. This is Kensington Church, one of the non-denominational powerhouses that has come to be known as a megachurch.
Jesus Christ didn't just appear to a handful of people.
If Catholicism, the original megachurch, has been about subtraction, places like Kensington are all about addition these days. More campuses, more services. You needed a ticket to guarantee your seat for Easter this year. Over its 5 campuses, 40,000 people attended Easter services. That's a good-sized city. Church here means fully produced live music and multimedia presentations that are as eye-popping as anything on your television. Pope Francis is talking about meeting parishioners where they're living their lives. Churches like Kensington may have beaten the Catholics to the threshold. The people who fill this church, how many of them do you suppose are former Catholics? People who've left the Catholic Church looking for something else?
Oh, I don't know. Once in a while you do a show of hands and it's probably 50, 60%.
Dan Mountney understands the question because he's one of them, though he doesn't really buy the term former Catholic.
Devin, I've told people for years, once Catholic, always Catholic. You know, I went to 12 years of Catholic school, and I mean, that's part of your fiber of your being. You know, it's not like you walk away from that. So much of that is inside of you, and I think it's awesome to have that as a background.
But, perhaps painfully for the Catholic Church, it is now background. 15 years ago, in a search for something more in his life, Dan found a home at Kensington that meant not only a change of church, but a change of occupation. He now works for Kensington Church.
I think Christianity has the greatest message in the world that is as powerful today as it was 2,000 years ago. I think churches on both sides of the aisle have lost sight of that a little bit, and they have no longer been able to make it relevant and accessible and exciting and hope-filled. And any church that loses that, you're going to lose people, because I think that's what people are longing for.
And on that, Archbishop Vigneron would agree. He, too, sees what's happening at places like Kensington.
It isn't that way is simply for us to imitate, but there are things that we need to learn from what's happening in the mega church.
But the church also has a challenge among people who've stayed. People like Corinne Foley.
We have quite a few homeless people that...
Corinne is not exactly in step with the church, and yet she's completely in step with her church. Some might use the term cafeteria Catholic, but she's hardly alone. She's a midwife for a largely impoverished community in Toledo. She cannot imagine advising against birth control.
I can only help those women in what ways I know how, and if that means that I'm going to let them know about birth control options that are out there, then that's part of my job.
Do you think that women should be allowed to be priests?
I do.
Do you think priests should be allowed to marry?
I do.
Then some would say that you are a classic cafeteria Catholic, that you just sort of take your bits and pieces that you want to believe in and ignore some of the other central teachings of the church.
Maybe I am.
And you're good with that?
I'm okay with that. I'm okay.
Corinne isn't an outlier. I've met a lot of Catholics just like her, attached to their Catholic identity, if not entirely to Catholic doctrine. If the polls are right, she is your average American Catholic.
And I take communion, and I don't have any guilt about it. And I take communion because it's something that I want to do each week.
Last year, the Archbishop of Detroit, Alan Vigneron, launched quite a debate within the church. He said that a Catholic who supports the idea of gay marriage is deeply out of step with the church's teaching and thus should not be taking communion. He's not sure the headlines respected the deeper reasoning, but he remains firm about it today.
To receive Holy Communion is a very personal act, but it's also a corporate act. It's saying, I'm in communion with the church. And when you make that statement, part of it is that I believe that what the church teaches is what Christ teaches, and that should be the measure for my life. And I was asking people to be consistent.
I don't think Pope Francis would ever say that. I don't know that he wouldn't ever believe it, but he wouldn't say it, because the message that he's trying to get to people is that don't disqualify yourself from being part of the Catholic community. So I think Pope Francis is on perhaps a different wavelength when it comes to that.
Vigneron strongly disagrees.
My position is the Church's position that when people receive Holy Communion, they should be doing it in good conscience, and that I'm calling them to examine their conscience if they're dissenting from the Church's teaching.
But does that square with the Pope's recent comments about communion?
In an interview he gave, he talked about receiving the sacraments, and he said the sacraments shouldn't be a prize. The sacraments are medicine. They should help you spiritually. And I think that gives you a window into his thinking, I think.
It's not my doctrine, it's not the Pope's doctrine. The established doctrine of the Church is that if you've committed a grievous sin before you receive Holy Communion, you need to repent and receive forgiveness in the sacrament of penance. So if someone does that, comes to receive Holy Communion, that's the right thing to do. It's that kind of further medicine. So I don't see any. I'm saying what the Pope is saying. We're singing off the same page of the hymnal.
We'll see if the rest of the Church follows, because a lot of the success factor of Francis depends on what bishops and archbishops around the world say and do.
It's a critical point. The marching orders of Pope Francis will only go as far as the way those orders are understood or interpreted.
We have a parishioner, his name is John, and every week during intercessions, he gets up and he asks us to pray for all our priests and bishops that they might follow the lead of our Pope Francis.
That's powerful. Powerful? Consider the position now of Lynn Pellerito, moving from locked out to locked in.
Francis makes me want to be a good Catholic.
It is one of the most famous quotes attributed to Jesus Christ. Suffer little children and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven. And yet, suffering children carved a deep, festering wound in the heart of the Church. More on that. We continue from the Vatican in just a moment. This spring, St. Peter's Square hosted a historic moment. Pope John the 23rd was recognized as a saint, and so was Pope John Paul II. Millions of people the world over agreed with that assessment, but for thousands who've been waiting for the Catholic Church to hear them, it made their blood boil. In April, the saints that stand watch over St. Peter's Square saw their ranks swell by 2. In a historic double canonization, 2 beloved former popes were recognized as saints in a ceremony that reminded the faithful that saints are not only ghosts of antiquity, they can be thoroughly modern figures, like Pope John the 23rd, who tried to create more Catholics all over the world, and Pope John Paul II, who seemingly wanted to meet every single one of them. 2 former popes raised to sainthood, presided over by the man of the moment, Pope Francis. With a delirious crowd packing St. Peter's, overflow crowds watching on television screens all over Rome, and an international audience tuning in, it looked like the happy family album this church has long needed. But part of the family was sitting it out.
Thousands of children lost their innocence under Pope John Paul II. And when he had the information, he had the authority, but he refused to take action that would protect the children. And as a result, thousands and thousands more children were raped by priests. And so that just does not rise to the level of saintly behavior.
Barbara Blaine is the founder of SNAP, the survivors network of those abused by priests. She says the sexual abuse from her priest started when she was 12 years old and went on for another 5 years.
When we started realizing that, we started asking each other and asking ourselves, Where's my perpetrator today? Most of our perpetrators were still in positions where they could have access to children. And many of us naively thought that when we reported our abuse to the church officials, that they were going to do the right thing.
Yes, mostly high marks for Pope Francis, but if there are demerits, they tend to be about his response to the wound that has been so stubborn to heal.
We have to be sure that we don't mistake setting up a commission for action.
The priesthood sex scandal was devastating for the church. Each case seemed to lead to two more. Blaine and others want a thorough scrubbing of the offenders from the priesthood, and the same for the bishops who at best turned a blind eye to the truth. I was in Rome in 2002 when John Paul II called in the American cardinals to deal with what was quickly becoming a mushroom cloud. Cardinal Adam Maida was there, and he'll always remember the plain directive from the Pope.
You know, his first line is that there's no place in the church for a priest who would abuse a child. He said that. He's been quoted. And that was that's maybe one of the strongest moments I remember. And I never saw him angry, but I know when he was firm.
In a way, the church was hamstrung by its own DNA. To the secular eye, a priest who has raped a child is beyond redemption. But to a church founded on the power of absolute forgiveness, no one is beyond redemption.
You got it.
So how do you...
It's an institution that calls to perfection, but yet equally understands failure and sin, right?
The Vatican says it has defrocked nearly 900 priests, and yet many cases remain open. And advocates for the victims say they are still waiting for the church to respond in full. In my conversation with Archbishop Vigneron, we talked about a wide array of topics, but it was only when the conversation turned to the sex abuse scandals that he seemed at a loss for words.
I have spoken to people who are victim survivors, and it is just horrific. I mean, there is no easy way to, I'm fumbling for words here. It is just so awful what has happened, especially to children. Nothing can give them back their innocence.
In those days when one horrendous story seemed to follow another, think of the pained majority, the hardworking, faithful priests suddenly painted with an enormous brush.
There were many times when I didn't want to wear a Roman collar in public. There are times when I just felt like I just don't want people to see me as a priest.
Father Carl Kaiser heads up U of D Jesuit High School. He talks about his role as a priest in an almost BC AD kind of way. For all of the conversations about bad priests, their innocent victims, and the church's response, far less has been said about the profound impact it's had on the priest of today.
I don't touch people ever anymore. Well, that's kind of odd. You know, you want to reach out to someone who's hurting, or you want to put your hand on someone's shoulder now and then, or you want to say, you know, you're a good person, but you don't do it with your hand on them, you know, because all of a sudden that's interpreted in a whole different way.
Father Kaiser doubts the world understands the profound changes the seminaries and orders have made to better screen candidates and change processes, but it all comes at a cost.
I'm wary of being touched by someone, you know, because I'm afraid that it'll be interpreted in some wrong way. So if someone comes up to me and puts their hand on my shoulder, if a kid does that, boy, I don't like brush them off, but I move away. I don't want anyone to touch me, because it's just, you're under the microscope all the time, and you don't want someone to say, that kid touched me. So
that has got to make you furious.
Well, it's so inhuman, because the reason why everybody becomes a priest is to help people.
The founding figure of this church was born of a perfect mother, and central to her perfection, the fact that she was a virgin. The problem with sex, when we come back.
Strange thing about this church, it is obsessed with sex. Absolutely obsessed. Now they will say, we with our permissive society and our rude jokes are obsessed. No, we have a healthy attitude. We like it, it's fun, it's jolly, because it's a primary impulse. It can be dangerous and dark and difficult. It's a bit like food in that respect, only even more exciting. The only people who are obsessed with food are anorexics and the morbidly obese. And that, in erotic terms, is the Catholic Church in a nutshell.
That's Stephen Fry in a widely distributed diatribe against the church and its positions on what some would suggest is one of the most human things that people actually do. It's interesting. Think about it for a minute. From the virgin birth right through to the modern debates about birth control and gay marriage and the scandals in the priesthood, the church is spending a lot of time talking about sex.
I think the pelvic issues certainly have alienated a lot of Catholics.
Ah, how elegantly put. The pelvic issues. The Catholic Church is hardly alone in the world of faith in its endorsement of sexual modesty, or its mandate that sex should be limited to the confines of a marriage between a man and a woman. It also has plenty of company in its position against abortion. But the below-the-belt issues seem to nag at the Catholic Church in a unique way. Some of that may be due to the primacy of Mary in Catholic theology. The mother of Jesus is seen as a synonym for perfection. And central to Mary's perfection is her virginity. She brought forth a child without being sullied by the sexual act that produced the other billions of us. In fact, the Church teaches the idea of perpetual virginity, that she remained a virgin for life. The starting point of the Church then informed a chain of sexually focused demands that affirm that sex should be creational rather than recreational. The ban on birth control seems to suggest that every conjugal act is an attempt at conception.
It doesn't mean that everybody has to have 100 children. It means that we should take our role as our own human role as procreators quite seriously. And when we think about how we're going to be as a married person and family life, that we're thinking about that. It's not just what do I want today and how do I get more of. And I think the church is really trying to say, how do you be more generous?
It's hard to know what the Church's position on sex and marriage is costing them with parishioners, but you have to believe it's costing them at the seminary. The Church has had a tough time attracting young men to the priesthood, and no doubt a life of celibacy, of foregoing a family, can be a tough sell. Young men considering the priesthood are generally trying to make that commitment right in the middle of a hormonal hurricane.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's a huge issue. There's why people don't join the priesthood. And there are numbers of young people today, young men who would be terrific priests but want to have a family, and that's a fact.
It wasn't easy along the way because some people were really supportive, friends, family, but there were some who never really understood why I would do that. Why would I sacrifice my own desires, my own life in service of the people of God?
Defenders of the Church's stance look at a society tormented by everything from unwanted pregnancies to AIDS, and are hard-pressed to see a world that needs more sexual liberation.
I think it's the world that is obsessed with sex because the Catholic Church has been teaching these teachings for 2,000 years and they haven't changed. If you look at the evidence, the Church has proven right over and over again.
Lewis Brown says his college days left him believing the Church has it right.
I don't know how many guys that I know, my buddies, who had the opportunity to enter a relationship and get out in 2 seconds because there was no consequences. And yeah, exactly, essentially use a woman.
We live in a world that has become hyper-sexualized, from music and movies to the ads that use sex to sell just about anything. But when we give into that world, Archbishop Vigneron believes we're selling ourselves short.
Maybe we need to have a little more confidence in ourselves about how good we can be with the help of Christ.
Are 4 months pregnant.
And yet the guilt that used to come with premarital sex has faded, no doubt. It's an age in which a morning television host can announce she's getting married and she's 4 months pregnant to hearty congratulations. Could the Church help itself by recognizing the new reality?
I'm not interested in a membership drive, I'll tell you. I'm interested in sharing what I have, which is this knowledge of the Lord Jesus.
The Pope is the leader of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, and yet he can have an influence far beyond these columns, far beyond his own denomination even. That part of the Francis factor, just ahead.
In Detroit, and Alliance Catholic Credit Union, empowered by faith, inspired by you.
There are t-shirts you can buy here in Rome that show Pope Francis in a cape gussied up as a superhero. He's not wild about that, by the way. But when you're just shy of 80 years old and a religious leader and you find yourself on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, well, it would seem to fulfill the demand of the poet Robert Browning, who said that a man's reach should exceed his grasp.
No matter where you go, people of all denominations are moved by many of the things that he does and calling our attention to what's important in life. And that's, and he's doing it in a real way.
Understandably, the church sees itself as a straight line through time. You can move a compass all over the place. If it's true, it just keeps pointing north. And yet, make the rounds among the leaders of the church, among those in the pews, among those outside the traditional Catholic fold. Something feels different.
Under Benedict, the question was, what do I have to believe to call myself a Catholic? I think under Pope Francis, the question has changed. The question under Francis is, how do I have to act if I call myself a Christian?
There was this kind of breath of fresh air that just kind of came in and said something's different, something's new. This guy has something that's going to make a difference within the church.
It's like an old house that you walk into. It's a little musty smelling, and then you throw open the windows and raise the drapes, and this fresh air blows in, and it's like, oh my goodness, it feels different. And I think that's part of what's going on in the Catholic Church right now.
We have to be modern, we have to be contemporary, but that doesn't mean we leave the truth.
You talk to young Catholics like Lewis Brown. He is positively vibrant about his faith, and he has been for a while. He knows Pope Francis is bringing some back to the church. He just hopes that while Francis is trying to meet them where they live, that they return the favor.
If you're downtown and you don't know the homeless folks outside your building, and if you're not taking somewhat of an interest in them and trying to help them where you can, to the degree that you can, there's a problem.
Yes, you have to believe that the Pope will be disappointed if the faithful aren't moved to act. But that would seem more possible in the sunshine of this feel-good moment for the Church. And that means something.
You need the good news. I mean, that's what the Catholic Church lives on at the end of the day, you know, the good word.
So that beautiful balance of mercy, love, non-judgmental, but calling to perfection and virtue, he's got that ballet down to an art, and he's doing like Jesus.
But there is a warmth about him, Devin, that is so undeniable. You're just drawn to him, as he did on the night that he was elected. When you meet him, he will say, "Pray for me." He is always asking for your prayers, and I'm thinking, me pray for you? You really need to pray for me.
If he can't create some change, I'll be disappointed. And if you talk to me again, you know, in a couple years, I may have distanced myself again, but he's brought me back.
To be a papal tiger, it certainly helps to get the job early. Pope John Paul II was just 58 when he was elected. That's how you end up with a 26-year papacy. Pope Francis was 76 when he emerged as Pope on that balcony behind me, but so was Pope John the 23rd. His 5 years as Pope fairly flipped the Catholic Church upside down, and he is now St. John the 23rd. We can't see the future from here, but the Church and its leader are being watched in ways we haven't seen in a very long time. And around here, a long time is saying something. Thanks so much for being with us tonight. I'm Devin Scillian. Good night from St. Peter's Square at the Vatican.